Welcome to the podcast where we try to inspire better work performance. Thanks for listening.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on Management Muse. Today's episode is sponsored by the Uncertainty Playbook, 14 strategies for work success in a chaotic world, written by Jeffrey Tumlin and myself, Cindi Baldi. And it's available on Amazon, all our websites, and eggheadpress.com. So if you want to check it out, feel free. We've had some very nice reviews. We appreciate that a great deal. And on that note, today, as your host, I'm flying solo. Old Jeffrey Tumlin won't be here. He's not going to be here for a couple of episodes. We got some guests coming in, and then eventually he'll cycle back. Today's topic, I want to talk about how managers slowly descend into hating their customers and what to do about it. So I'm going to start with a story, and it partly explains why I'm flying solo, because basically my house is uninhabitable. And the story is about my apartment building. We live in a high rise, and about a month and a half ago, Jeff was home, and it's not super unusual as consultants that we can go a month without being home. And so anyway, Jeff was home, and I had just left the place. When I left, it was normal. And while Jeff was there, he noticed that the floors were warping. They're wooden floors. And so he reported it to our apartment building, and they called me up and they're like, hey, we're going to put a dehumidifier in there. And by the way, we looked, and we think because you put boxes in with the AC unit, we think maybe you knocked a hose, and that caused this damage, which I'm not there. Jeff isn't there. Jeff sent pictures. There was no water. The warping was pretty far away from that closet. So I'm dubious, but I'm not there. And if we did do the damage, that's why you buy insurance, right? And so I'm like, okay, proceed. Put in the humidifier. That's the last thing that I hear. And so I'm going through my vacation, and periodically I'm getting contacted by other people who live in the same apartment building, and they're reporting humidity of like 70 to 90%. And I find out that other people have had a similar problem to what I've had, and that they've already ripped out other units' floors, and that they put the blame on them. And we're trying to put the blame on some of the other people. And so it was like a whole lot of units were having similar problems. And at each turn, the management was blaming the customer, and in some cases, getting them to make claims against their insurance. But they're not talking to me. So the last thing I know is that I only had a dehumidifier put into the unit. And so I come back, and I have no floor. They've had a month to fix it. I have no floor. I'm having to climb over the credenza to go to the bathroom, because my whole living room furniture is in my bedroom. And I'm starting to investigate what happened. And basically, it's pretty clear to me, like, there's no evidence that I was the source of damage. And it's pretty clear to me that basically a number of people tried to tell them, or did tell them, that there was a problem before my incident, and that if they had taken them seriously and hadn't had the initial reaction of blaming them and taking no responsibility for the building, that they probably would have been able to actually beat the problems that I had, and probably a number of other people had after me. And so I'm prepared to call in USAA and get an adjuster, because an adjuster coming out is going to look at it and be like, yeah, we're not paying for this because this isn't your fault. And I'm prepared for that scenario and having to deal with management. And they have since come in and actually put down the floor. So I'm not really sure where it stands. Maybe I'm going to pay, right? Like maybe I need to make a claim. Maybe I don't. But I know that anybody who looks at it, like you don't need an engineering degree to see that, like, it's not us. We don't have the evidence that it was us. And I think that this is an interesting story, because I think the way that the management team gets there, because there is a sort of, I don't have to deal with them a whole lot. Like I said, we're gone like months at a time. Like 90% of the time, we're not even home. But there is kind of a little bit of a sense of disdain for the tenants. And in all honesty, I've met my neighbors, and 98% of them are lovely, but there is 2% that is a little bit of a problem. We had an incident where, like, at one point in time, some thefts were happening in the building. And so they changed their policy where if you were getting anything delivered, anything, then it had to be dropped off at the office, and then the office would call the tenant, and then the tenant would need to come down and pick it up. And I remember coming to the front desk for something, I don't know what, and somebody being down there, one of my neighbors being down there, and just reaming out the poor office person who had nothing to do with his policy. And the policy actually makes sense because, lo and behold, they had to go all the way out of their way to get on an elevator and come downstairs to pick up their takeout food instead of, having DoorDash come up and bring it to their door. And this was like an epic tragedy in this person's life. And a couple of other scenarios that have happened where like the tenants were a little nuts. And so I think and again, 98% wonderful people, but you're always going to get some who are a little weird. But there's probably legitimately 2% that are a little bit hard to deal with. But I do think that what happened is that once you start having, 2% where you're having negative interactions, there is a tendency to protect themselves psychologically. There is a tendency for them to start avoiding the tenants, and then they're only having interactions with people who are negative. Like they start the avoidance because they don't want to feel the pain of A, conflict, and B, to the extent that they are committed to the organization and feel responsible for it, they don't want to feel the pain of being criticized because that will feel very personal. And so they start avoiding all tenants, and only the negative ones track them down, and even the positive ones only track them down when they have a problem. So they're basically then not having nice interactions and only having negative interactions. And then that phenomenon combined with our negativity bias, which is basically as human beings, we put more weight on a negative interaction. And we do this, that's part of the reason why we're here. Our ancestors did it, and that's why they survived. And so for example, you could be, and not, everybody who's ever spoken publicly has had this experience. You can have somebody in the audience who looks unhappy, and maybe they're unhappy for something that has nothing to do with you. And you can have 99 other people who are having a great time, and somehow you are overly focused on that person who looks unhappy. And so that's an example of negativity bias. In this case, the example is because they're only having interactions with people who are either having problems and or are negative, they start to overweight all those experiences and start feeling like everybody's negative. And so you have these two phenomena that are happening to managers that are helping them slide into hating their customer. The first is this idea that they're protecting themselves psychologically by avoiding everybody. And that means that they wind up only dealing with the most motivated, which means, generally speaking, they're only dealing with the people who have a problem or are negative. And then the other issue is that you have this negativity bias that you start to overweight the negative interactions. And so basically all the positive in the building gets diluted out, and same with any organization. And then the manager starts to feel very resentful, can start to feel very resentful towards their customers. And so that's where I think where we are at. But the consequence of that in this particular story is that they've now had to replace a whole lot of floors. But I mean, I am really dubious over whether or not they actually have the underlying cause fixed, because I can see water damage in the hallway, but they're not, they don't really listen to you anyway. And B, after feeling like their first instinct was to just try to get me to take care of it, to lay the blame on me and to know that they did it to other people, I'm not really feeling warm and fuzzy about them anymore. So, like historically, I have loved where I live. But at this point, like, I almost don't even feel responsible for pointing out the things that really, if their employees just demonstrated a sense of curiosity, they could readily see. But instead, their handymen are doing what the manager wants and basically, theorizing with no evidence how the tenant could be responsible. And so it changes for me and the tenants from having a relational relationship to a transactional. Like, I'm going to check the boxes and pay my rent, and we'll see where we are when my term comes up. And they may wind up losing a tenant who is, 90% not there, which I can't imagine you could have a better tenant than that. So that's sort of like the erosion that is happening. And because of the negativity of the manager falling into sort of this role of hating their customer, you see, one, that it has gone to other employees, and two, that they have lost empathy for their tenants. And therefore, as a result of that, they've lost the curiosity. Like, if they had any sort of empathy for us, they would have been a little bit concerned and then motivated to actually explore what the real problem was. And so anyway, this is all piling on because they've spent already a lot of extra money that wasn't necessary. And I suspect that there will be even more money in the future that gets spent because I don't think the underlying problem has actually been resolved. And so that's just an example of how this hatred that sort of like infiltrates a manager can cause like some pretty serious damage, and how it gets there. And so I think the first thing is managers need to think about how they're talking about their customers. So, I mean, obviously, like, if you're putting them down, like, that's pretty clear cut. Like, if you have a lot of disdain or cynicism about your customer, you probably know it in the way that you speak, and maybe you haven't noticed, but it is having an impact on your employees. It could be having an impact in one of two ways. It could be that you're spreading the cynicism, because emotions are actually spreadable. No matter how much you hide them, they do leak. But if you're outright speaking it, then it's not a leak. You're just spreading it. And that can have an impact on an employee in either that they join you or they start to distance themselves and they disagree with you and they essentially kind of take the customer side. And then at that point, like, they're probably looking for an alternative if it's real bad. And so that can cause performance problems and turnover problems. And those are two important reasons why we would be interested in actually not doing this. And so I think the straightforward one is the disdain and cynicism. The less straightforward one is joking. And, I got a little bit of jackery about me. I make fun of people and I mean it in good spirits, but sometimes I do it. And I know that I had to catch myself talking about some of the customers, not current ones. This is back when I was pretty young, back when I was younger, and sort of telling people the things customers do that are both surprising and gross and that you would like to stop them from doing. And so, I had to, you have to figure out how to communicate that and demonstrate dealing with that professionally without sort of making the joke, and then it gives permission to everybody else make the joke. And underlying that joke is actually disdain for your customers. And again, I can absolutely guarantee you in my own experience, I actually love customers for this particular business I'm thinking of, that in a different lifetime I was part of. But you do have, that 2% that you're like, who raised you? And so I had to catch myself doing that because I started seeing employees pick up and I could hear myself in the things that they were saying, but it was creating actually an adversarial relationship with customers who weren't just the 2%. And so the first thing is to like kind of check your own language and especially think about if you're joking, because I think that joking is a little bit insidious. Like you're doing it to sort of lighten the mood, and it is funny, but it is also communicating a negative. And I think you have to check your language to make sure that you're not communicating something to your employees that you don't intend to communicate to them. Along with that, because that's the more blatant forms of how emotions are contagious, but the more subtle form is the ways that it leaks out. And so it's the tensing that you feel when somebody's approaching, and the eye rolls, and sort of like the subtle markers where you're not actually vocalizing it, but somebody who works with you can pick up that you have a negative feeling. And for that, you have to work on reframing. And so in this particular case, instead of thinking about, or this particular topic, instead of thinking about the customer being a bad customer, you need to reframe it. Like they're not a chore to deal with. Like, A, you don't know that they're a bad customer. Like we need to think about maybe they're right. And that should be the first thing that you're thinking about when somebody comes up to you and is complaining. Like maybe they're right. Maybe it's messed up and it needs to be fixed. And then oftentimes with dealing with people, both in the public at large and in organizations and the various work that I do, a lot of the time when somebody is negative, you can actually see that it actually has nothing to do with you or the organization, but they're just in a bad state, right? And that's part of the contagion that's coming from the customer into the organization. And when that's happening, if you can identify it, then you don't have to take it so personally. Like you have to listen to them. And personally, I consider it like a game, right? Like if I see somebody who's jacked up and it's got nothing to do with me, can I actually reset them? So when they walk out, they have a better day. And generally speaking, when I go into an interaction, even when it's a neutral interaction, I tend to think of it like I'm a dog, like, right? Like I'm a happy Labrador, right? Can I make this person's day a little bit better? But if they're negative, then I really want to be able to reset them and move them out. And so, and that mentality, that desire, the intention in which that I'm trying to approach somebody, I think, and I know it comes through because again, people are reading all the signals. It's not just the way that you're talking to them. It's all the signals that you're giving them. Like I think about a customer who approaches me with a problem as somebody who's giving me an opportunity to fix something. And if it turns out that it's really just like an irritant, like it's not something that's really either necessary or can be fixed, then it's about whether or not I can reset them just as a human being. But I always think about it as like I want them to feel like they're appreciated for coming and giving me a chance, and that I'm wrapping my hands around them so that way they feel like they're going to be taken care of. And that does not mean that I can always take care of them. Sometimes I can't do what they want for a whole variety of reasons. Like sometimes it's just not even in my abilities, but sometimes it's not in the resources. But if they can feel like somebody actually cared and heard them out, sometimes that's actually enough. And sometimes you're not going to get there. Sometimes you're going to have customers and you just can't come to sort of like an even ground, but at least you tried and it wasn't on you. And so I think if you reframe the interactions as more of an opportunity, a chance to learn, a chance to see if you can do something nice for somebody else. I mean, everybody's like, pay it forward, like the games with like somebody goes and they pay for the car behind them at McDonald's, and then the next person pays and they see how long they can do it. Like that's that whole idea of paying it forward, right? Well, like pay it forward with somebody emotionally. They're coming to you. They may or may not really be thinking about what they're doing, but they're contagious in terms of emotions on the negative side. And can you be contagious back and be the anecdote that resets them? And I find that a little bit fun. And when I'm able to actually do it, really gratifying, because I know that person's day is actually better because of what I did, because I took advantage of emotional contagion. And so experiment a little bit with that, I would say. Last point in terms of like things for dealing with customers is like you have to protect your employees. So like if you're trying to prevent your employees from hating their customers, first you have to not be the source of the hate. But you also have to protect them so that way they don't develop their own disdain. And that doesn't mean never taking the customer side. It also doesn't mean always taking the customer side. Like I don't really agree with the customer is always right, because I mean, sometimes customers, for, like I said, a lot of reasons, sometimes because they're trying to get one over on you, sometimes because they're just having a bad day, sometimes because they're just confused and therefore frustrated, and then you're getting the frustration. And so there's a whole bunch of things that might make a customer not right. And so I don't think you have to pretend like they're always right. What you do have to do is when the situation happens, you have to like deal with the customer in a professional way and demonstrate dealing with a professional way. And what you don't do if you're going to respond in a professional way is you don't match their emotion or their level of emotion. So you're trying to pull them back down to you. So they're matching you instead of you matching them. Because what happens when somebody's upset is they come in at a higher velocity, higher volume, and more negative emotions. And our instinct is to match them at that level. But we as managers and leaders need to actually stay at the lower level and see if we can bring the customer down to our level where like it's just talking and it's starting to remove some of the excess emotions, not all emotions. Because again, like we can do a lot with positive emotions, but we don't want to be adding in our own negative. And so you can role model that and you can actually help an employee figure that out. And then after an employee has a negative incident, which is bound to happen, it's helping them reframe it. And so they've had a little bit of trauma. And so it's grounding them again. 98% of our customers are wonderful. This is just that 2%. And maybe that person is always negative and like every time you see them, you're going to dread them. Or maybe it's a perfectly good customer, but they had a bad day. And differentiating between those two, and then also like refocusing, like we can't take one incident that was negative and make it about all of our customers. All of our customers are not jacked up. And so sometimes in regrounding your employee, like it's going over, look, we had a customer who did this the other day. Our customers are always so sweet on social media. Like, look, like they appreciate us. Like they see what we do and they appreciate us. I mean, you have to come up with real evidence, but I'm going to go out on a limb and assume it's there. And so it's that effort to sort of get them out of that negative bias spin and get them out of the trauma. Like, and I say trauma because it's not like trauma, right? It's just like that incident had high conflict and that person is having a little bit of a reaction to it. And it's helping ground them back into reality that we don't need to extrapolate and make it into this bigger issue than it actually is. And so again, going down our checklist. So it's checking our own words, making sure that our humor isn't out of whack. It's reframing the incident. So it's not that they're a problem or bad, but that when you interact with a lot of people, you're going to get some friction. And we should look at that as an opportunity to learn and grow, and maybe even a challenge in just trying to help somebody get out of a funk. Like, I make it a game. And then it's your job as a manager to protect your employees, both in the moment from the negative that sometimes they're going to happen. And when they do, helping reground them into the reality that actually exists, which is the reality that doesn't have the negativity bias. So those are the main strategies that I would try, and like really think about yourself and your job and your company, and whether or not maybe you have slid into becoming more hateful to employees, and start working on pulling yourself back, because customers can be demanding, but they are providing you with an income, and hopefully you generally like your company and your job, and you feel like that provides you with a purpose. And there's probably a lot of good things in there. At least I hope so. So try to use these strategies to pull yourself back and protect your organization's culture from becoming overly negative. All right, y'all. Thanks for tuning in to the solo This is Inside Cindy's Mind episode of Management Muse. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on Management Muse. We are a podcast/YouTube channel that we hope is entertaining and educational. If you are on YouTube, we would appreciate you subscribing and maybe leaving a comment and a like. If you are on any of the podcasts listening to this, we would appreciate stars, following, comments, all the good stuff. We want to say thank you to Sarah and Rebecca, and then, of course, everybody at Design at Work. And then, just as a last-minute reminder, we also want to mention that we are management and communication professionals working in the field, but also have degrees that back us in science. All that being said, we are talking in generalities on this podcast. We do not actually know your particular situation. So proceed with common sense and maybe a little bit of experimentation on your end. And we hope that you make the world a more beautiful place by making work a more enjoyable place. See you next time on Management Muse.